I accidentally changed my personality by playing party games, and it actually made my life more meaningful. It turns out you can harness the same mechanism to make your life more fulfilling too. Before I get into that though, let's play that game. It's 2 truths, 1 lie. I'm going to list 3 anecdotes, only 2 of which will be true, and your job is to guess the one that isn't. So, first, I once drove down the wrong side of a major freeway for nearly 5 minutes. Second one is that in the sequence of events leading up to me giving this talk, I became an ordained minister. And finally, while trying to write this talk, I met Grand Duke Guillaume V of Luxembourg. Back in the final year of high school, before I had silly anecdotes like those, I was at a party on a crowded couch in a poorly lit room that already smelled of alcohol. My circle of friends was going around sharing their anecdotes for 2 truths, 1 lie. And as my turn approached, I started to panic. Everyone else seemed to be able to come up with these fantastic, amazing, unbelievable stories. And there I was, sitting there, unable to come up with anything. Then it was my turn. I'd been so captivated by everyone else that my mind was blank. I floundered about for a minute trying to think of something and I just could not. I had to settle for something I was really disappointed with. About 15 minutes later, I was just munching on some chips when inspiration finally struck. If only it happened earlier. But I didn't want it to go to waste, so I took out my phone and I noted it down. This will be important later in the talk. Now, when I started this talk, you might have thought to yourself, how on earth could party games change my personality? And you're right that it does sound a little bit disingenuous. Party games didn't change my personality, but taking one particular party game a little bit too seriously did. That right there is reframing. I didn't actually alter the substance of the statement, but now we're seeing it from a different perspective. This will also be important later. Now, the whole process of party games changing my personality started with identity. And my favourite way of explaining identity is to imagine that your personality is an actor. And your identity is just whichever role this actor happens to be playing. And there are obviously an almost infinite number of possible identities, but one that's relevant to me, and I know many of you, is that of student. The student identity can be more nuanced though. You might consider yourself to be a lazy student or an academic weapon. And identifying as a good student is a combination of a role that you identify with, student, and a set of values. In this case, things like diligence or ambition perhaps. Values are one of the deepest layers of your identity. There are myriad different values with which you might identify. For example, you might consider yourself to be cautious, or bold, funny, or serious. These values might have root in your personality, they usually do, but they might not. They could be cultural. Identity isn't that serious, but it could change your life. For instance, identity has a huge influence over your behaviour. Perhaps the most clear-cut example of this could be your reaction to a football game, which, depending on your identity and the result thereof, could be almost anything in the entire spectrum of human emotion. Identity can also lead to action. We usually attribute action to motivation, which is certainly true in many cases, but in many other cases it's actually the result of your identity. I can illustrate this with a tragic tale from my own experience. The other day, I was peacefully asleep one morning, very peacefully asleep, when suddenly, beep, 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 I'd set a brutally early alarm, 7 a.m, to go do something with some friends. And as I'm sure you guys can relate to, I did not want to leave my bed. I did not want to leave my room. I was, frankly, rather opposed to the idea. I couldn't find any motivation to do it. But then I remembered, hang on, I'm not the kind of person who lets down their friends like that. Damn it. Suddenly, this identity of loyalty compelled me to get out of bed, even though I still very clearly did not want to. And you can see how identity leads to action. The most interesting part is that these actions can actually influence your personality and your identity. Part of the theoretical framework for this was developed in the 1960s by an American psychologist called Darrell Bem. It's called self-perception theory. It suggests that your attitudes aren't always an inherent part of who you are, but sometimes they're just something that you figure out by observing your own behaviour and drawing conclusions as to which attitudes must have caused it, like an external observer would. For example, going back to that idea of loyalty, I didn't used to have particularly strong opinions about what kind of friend I was. But I started to notice that I'd try to be there for them. And observing that behaviour, I concluded that it was because of loyalty, which made me a more loyal person because suddenly I identified as such. And a couple of brutal early morning wake-ups later, this identity had been reinforced by experience. And self-perception theory can work with all kinds of traits. For example, you might come to realise how kind you are after noticing how much you've helped people recently. Acting in a way that's consistent with your values is actually really important for your well-being. To me, it's not only part of what makes life fulfilling and meaningful, but it's also what makes you authentic. Identity, turns out, can be shaped by what you identify about yourself. This could create a really interesting dynamic with your values. Let's say you identify as being funny, because these values don't need to feel fundamental. And being funny is something that you value. Those two things will play with each other to make your life just that little bit more meaningful and fulfilling. And it'll definitely make you feel like a more authentic version of yourself. And this, altogether in turn, will probably help you be a funnier person. It can be a real virtuous cycle, positive feedback loop that over longer periods of time can change your habits in response to those shifting identities, and these changing habits can even change your personality. So this is obviously brilliant if you like the person you think you are and you want to keep becoming that person. But what if you don't? Well, I'm here to tell you how party games changed my personality. As you already know, the game in question was 2 Truths, 1 Lie. The problem with this game is that it's really difficult to improvise, or at least it was for me. And that led to me assuming that I just wasn't an interesting person. This is another example of self-perception theory in action, because I saw myself unable to rapidly improvise interesting anecdotes, and I just ascribed that to not being interesting rather than perhaps not being experienced. That notes document I mentioned at the beginning started a huge shift. I began to note down all kinds of anecdotes as they came to me in my daily life. And as the list grew, I started trying to reframe them in the most interesting ways I could. For example, that first anecdote, the most boring way to reframe it, instead of saying that I drove down the wrong side of the road for 5 minutes, the most boring way to reframe it, which we usually default to, would be to say that there were roadworks that took a long time to get through. By contrast, the most extreme way of reframing it, given that this happened in Australia and we are currently in Europe where we drive on the right, the most extreme way to reframe it could be to say that I drove on the wrong side of the road for 5 hours, only interrupted by a short 5 minutes when government employees, the road workers, were watching me. You already use reframing on your CV or LinkedIn, and the thing about reframing is that it suggests to your mind which conclusions to draw from a story or statement. So suddenly, by trying to show people these interesting or amusing stories, I was accidentally showing myself that my life was more interesting and amusing than I gave it credit for. Gradually, my behaviour started to shift along with my identity. One example of how this changed is that I started doing things partly just simply because they sounded kind of crazy. One thing that I did because of this is sign up to give a TEDx talk. And another example is that second anecdote I gave you guys, becoming an ordained minister. The most boring way to reframe it is to say that I filled out a form online. Alas, I do have to admit that I've never met the Grand Duke Guillaume V, but if Your Highness is watching online, I'd be delighted to make your acquaintance. By the end of this accidental process of identity reform, my self-image was much more aligned with my values, which made my life feel a little bit more fulfilling. And it's possible for anyone in this room to do what my party anecdotes list did to me in a more conscious way. The self is in constant flux, and you can harness that to find empowerment in the echoes of your past and become a more authentic version of yourself. We tend to see identity as being this kind of static construct. To make our lives more fulfilling, we'd be better off seeing it as more of a playful tool. And reframing can help you make the most of it. Thank you.